A few weeks ago, we got our feet wet with JavaScript when we looked at jQuery with the Learn jQuery in 15-minute series. We had a lot of fun, so we're going to continue on with that trend for the next few weeks. We're going to be looking at JavaScript and the DOM. These videos are going to be hosted by longtime dev tipster and patron of the show, Adam Recklow. Adam and I were emailing each other, and it came up that he's been teaching an introductory JS workshop to teenagers with an organization called Node School. And I thought this would be perfect for dev tips, so I invited him to present his material here. He's got 7 lessons for us, 4 today and 3 next week. They're really good, and I'm excited now to pass it over to Adam. I'll see you guys after the class.
Hello, my name is Adam Recklow, and I'll be your instructor for this course, JavaScript and the DOM. If you want to follow along with the exercises, I suggest you get an account on CodePen over at codepin.io. In this course, we're going to be covering the document object model. To begin, we're going to look at JavaScript objects and how that compares to the DOM. As we go along, we're going to be using some functional programming techniques to make our code more readable as well as flexible. We're going to be using event listeners to add interactivity to the page, and some global objects and functions such as the date object and the setInterval function, so we can get comfortable using those in our applications. In the process, we're going to create some cool projects. So if you want to get started with JavaScript and the DOM, let's go. So we know that DOM stands for Document Object Model, but we don't yet know what an object is. And I want to show you that first because I think it'll help you to better visualize what the DOM actually is. So to begin, we're just going to create a simple object. And so to do that, I'm going to declare a variable, give it the name object, and then set it to curly braces. So to actually put in information or data inside of an object, we use key value pairs. So for example, name, give it a key of name, and then a value of a string, which is my first name. And to separate key value pairs inside of an object, you just use commas for that. Now you can also put objects inside of other objects. So for example, I can put address and give it a value of an object, and then inside of there I can put more key value pairs. So I'm going to put state and set that to the value Florida. So now we have an object, but what about accessing data inside of objects and assigning them to new variables? Well, we can use dot notation to do that. So for example here, I'm just going to create a variable called my name and then set it equal to object.name. And if I want to see that in the console, I can just console.log that out. And here in CodePen has a nice little console here, and you should see your name in the console now. Now you can also change values inside of objects, and you can use dot notation for that as well. So if I want to change the state from Florida to Oklahoma, I can use dot notation. So I can say object.address.state and then set it equal to a new value. Okay, so now we kind of understand the basics of objects in JavaScript. Now I kind of want to show you the DOM object, and to do that we're going to change the view. So go to change view, then go to debug mode, and this is going to open a new window. Now I want you to right click, go to inspect element, and this is going to open up developer tools, and in the top here the tab that says console. Click on console. So I already have some data here from previously, but now I want to console.log the document object, so you can kind of take a look at that. So that's console.log and then just put document in there. And this gives us the HTML document. If you click on it, then we'll get the rest of that document here in the window and all of the different properties and values. Now look here, we have BG colors, which stands for background color, and it doesn't have a value, and that's why right now we have a white screen in the background. But what if we wanted to change that value to pink, for example? Well, we can use dot notation just like we did before to do that. So what we can do is we can say document dot and then BG color, and then we can set that to a new value and say pink. And when I do that, it changes the background to pink. So this was just a nice little simple introduction to JavaScript objects. So then you have a better idea of what the DOM is and how you will use it. At this point, we know that the DOM is a big object that has a set of key value pairs that's available to us to be able to, maybe change certain features to the page. More importantly, we also have functions that the document makes available to us as well that allows us to add, delete, and even create more interactivity on the page. So just as an example, I want to show you how we can create a paragraph tag, how we can then add some text content to it, and then be able to append that paragraph to the body of the document. So if I want to create a paragraph, I can just declare a variable and call it paragraph. And then what I can do is I can use the document create element function, and I can pass in the string p, which represents the paragraph tag. Now if I want to be able to add text content to that paragraph, I can say paragraph dot text content, which is a property on that element, and then I can give that the value of the DOM is the bomb. Now lastly, if I want to append that element to the page, I can just use the append child function that's available to us. So I can say document.body.append child, and I can pass in paragraph. And if everything works out right, then you should be able to see it on your screen there. So now we know that there's a bit more power to the DOM, and that's available to us through these different functions that currently maybe doesn't really do too much, but as we go forward, we're going to learn more about the functions that give us the ability to add more interactivity to the page. So in the last video, I showed you some of the functions that are available to us through the document object. And in this video, I want to show you an important function that's available to us that allows us to input a little bit more interactivity into the page. And that's the add event listener function. So to kind of carry on what we did in the last video, we're going to create an element, we're going to set its height, we're going to then append that element to the DOM, and then we're going to add the event listener to it. So to begin, let's just declare a variable and call it div. And then we're going to create the div element by using document.createElement, passing in a string of the capital letters div. And that relates to the div tag. Now let's give this div a height, because we're going to be using an event listener that listens to the mouse move over the DOM. And as you know, if elements do not have other elements inside of them, then they don't have a height. But we do want this event listener to work over the entire web page. So we need to set the height of the web page and of this element to 100% of the view height. To do that, we can just say div.style.height is equal to 100% of the view height. And then all we have to do is append this to the DOM. So we can say document.body.append child, and then pass in the div. So now we have a div within the document object, and now we're going to add the event listener, which we said was going to be the mouse move. So we just have to set div here, and then we're going to add event listener, and then we just pass in mouse move, and what we get back is a callback function that will tell us the event that's happening on the DOM and give us a little bit of information that we can use to then maybe add some more interactivity. So if you kind of want to see this and kind of visualize what it looks like, event is just a regular object. So if we console.log and then we go over here to change view and we go to debug mode, then we can right click and we can inspect element, and then we can click on the console tab, and every time I move my mouse over the DOM, it's going to log out some information in this object. So what we have is a target, we have buttons, we have client X, client Y, layer X, and layer Y. What we want is client X and client Y, which is the coordinates of the cursor in the X and Y plane. So X extends from 0 to the left all the way to infinity to the right, and Y starts at 0 at the top and all the way to infinity at the bottom. So as you see, the numbers get higher as I go over here and lower as I get closer to the top left corner. So what we want to do is we want to display the client X and client Y on the web page. So to do that, I'm going to declare some variables first. So I'm going to say var X equals event.clientX, and then I'm going to say var Y equals event.clientY. And then just as we did in the previous video, we can use text content to display this on the page. So I can say div text content is equal to X, and then I'm going to just separate it with a comma and then plus Y. So then if we hover over this, we get the coordinates of the cursor, the X and Y coordinates of the cursor in the top left corner. Now this is not too interesting at this point, so what I want to do now is to kind of make it, more aesthetic. Let's change the background color in relation to the X and Y coordinates. To do that, all we have to do is set the style of the background color. So we can say div.style.background color is equal to RGB. And then I'm going to pass in X as the R value, and then separate with that with a comma, pass in Y as the G value, and then just give it 100 as the B value. So now what we should see is when I hover over this, the DOM is going to change colors based on the X and Y coordinates of my mouse. And if we do this on the debug mode, we have to first refresh, and then we get these nice cool colors on the page. So in this video, we learned that the DOM gives us a little bit more than just simple functions that allow us to put things on a page or take things off the page. It gives us the add event listener function, which gives us a callback function of the event, and using that information to then be able to add more interactivity to the page. So in the last video, I showed you how we could change the background in relation to where the mouse is on the screen. And I think we have a good solution at this point, but what I'd like to do is refactor this so that we can make it a little bit more flexible and more functional in nature. And when I mean functional programming, I'm referring to the paradigm where you're trying to use functions to map inputs to outputs. And I know that probably sounds a little theoretical at this point, so let's just kind of jump in and go from having the imperative code that we have now to more functional code. So to begin, we're going to create a function, and the way that you do that is you use the keyword function, and then afterward you're going to give it a name. So I'm going to call this full screen. And then after that, you give it 2 parentheses. Now the parentheses take in arguments, and I want to give it one argument that we're going to pass in when we instantiate it. And I'll show you what instantiation is later when we actually have to create this element. Now after you pass in an argument, then you end with these two parens, and inside of the curly braces, inside of the curly braces is where our functionality will be. So since we're just creating this full screen element, we can then take all of this here and we can cut it, and then we can paste it. And let's tidy it up. And because I'm passing in the element that I want to create here, that is what is going to be passed into this. So when I instantiate the function or call the function, then what's going to be put here is the string capital div, and that is what is going to be passed into here. Okay, I'm going to get rid of these comments. And so instead of div, I guess I can still call it div, but I'm going to call it new element just to give it a new name. New element. And then it gets appended to the DOM using append child. So what we need to do now is we need to return new element, because this is what's going to be taken in from another function. So we create a function to create an element, and we have the element, we have the styles, but now we need to pass that element on to the event listener. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new function, and I'm going to call it input. And what it's going to take are a few arguments. So it's going to take a input type. It's going to take in a element, or I'll put something different like DOM element. And it's also going to take a callback. And just as before, we take the curly braces. And just to kind of explain, callbacks are what's used a lot in asynchronous programming. And because the add event listener is an asynchronous event, the callback is going to come in really handy later on. And you'll kind of see what I'm saying as we go further along. And just to clarify as well, asynchronous programming. So for example, the add event listener mouse move. So whenever I move my mouse, it's going to send an event to this callback function, pass it in here, so then we can use that data and information. So for example, getting the client X coordinate and the client Y coordinate. Well, when my mouse is not moving, there's no events that are being fired off. So there's going to be some time that passes, and then sometime afterward, could be any time. And once I start moving my mouse again, then I'm going to start getting events. Well, because it's not at regular intervals, that's considered asynchronous programming. So what we can do now is we can cut this out, and we can paste it there. And I'm going to delete that. Going to tidy this up a little bit, and I'm going to get rid of the console.log. So full screen now, this element, we're going to be passing it into this function, and it's going to be our DOM element. So here I'm going to put DOM element, and because we have an input type, which is going to be mouse move, I'm going to change this out and put it as input type. And so we're getting the information here, and because we want to kind of extract out what the output is going to be, we're going to cut this, but before we do that, we're going to create another function called output. And so inside of here, we can put what we want our output to be. Control X, Control V. So because this is an asynchronous event, we don't know when we're going to be getting these events. So as you saw in the previous video, when I console.logged this information, and I moved my mouse on the screen, you could see in the log that these events are getting fired every time I move the mouse. So since we're not going to be able to get this information synchronously, we use what's called a callback. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass in the DOM element. I'm going to pass in X, I'm going to pass in Y. Now this information can then be used and utilized to then be able to put what we want on the output. And so when this input gets instantiated, we're going to be calling this callback. And so in place of callback, we're going to actually be putting in output. So just imagine that this is output, and output is now going to accept an element, an X and a Y. So because we know that output is going to be called with these three arguments, we can then put those arguments in here. And I'm just going to call them element, X, and Y. And then in our function, we can say element there, and then X and Y is already labeled correctly, so we don't have to change that. And here's our new functions. So just to kind of give a brief overview again of what's happening, we have a full screen function that takes an element type. And like I said, when we instantiate this, we're going to be passing in the string capital div. And what this is going to do is it's going to create the new element. It's going to give it a height. It's going to append that element to the DOM, and then it's going to return that element that we have. Now the input is going to take an input type, which we said was going to be mouse move. Then we're going to accept that DOM element that we're going to take in, and then we're going to call a callback. And the reason why we need to use a callback is because this add event listener is asynchronous. So we just need to, whenever this event fires, we need to then capture that event and pass along the information. So we need to pass on the DOM element, we need to pass on X and Y to a callback function, which is going to be output. And output is then going to take that element, take the X, take the Y, and put that into the DOM. So if we want to wire this up, what we can do is we can say input, and then so at this point we're instantiating this function, or we're calling this function. So we said when we instantiate it, we need to give it an input type. So we're going to say mouse move, and we're going to give it a DOM element, which is going to be this function, full screen, passing in the capital letters div. So we can say full screen, and then capital letters. And then, like we said previously, we have a callback, and we know that our callback is going to be output. So I can just put output here. And if everything is working correctly, then we can see that it's functioning as we expected on the screen. So this is the refactoring of the previous lesson to make our code a little bit more functional in nature. Now it's not totally perfect. Reason being is because we have some side effects. So a side effect is basically when you have input and you have unexpected output. Now if this wasn't here and all it did was return a new element, I could expect that what I get in return is going to have a height of 100 and it's going to be a div, for example. But because I have this side effect, this is what kind of doesn't make it a pure function, and somewhat goes against the rules of functional programming, but we can overlook that for now. And so we have, as best we can, use functional programming to refactor our code and to make it a little bit cleaner. And what's nice about that too is maybe instead of div, I could put another type of element here instead of div. So it could be, maybe I put a main, because in HTML5 we have main tags now. So it could be main, for example, instead of just div. And this could be click. So this would be looking for click events instead of mouse move events. So then when I click on the screen, it's changing based on clicks and not mouse move. So that's what's really nice about functional programming. It just allows us to map our inputs to our outputs, kind of separate concerns, and then gives us a little bit more flexibility to change, what kind of events and interactions we're trying to create.
Wasn't that awesome? Adam is a really good teacher, and putting this video together, I realized that I mess up way more than he does. I don't know what that says about me. Anyway, I said earlier that Adam is a member of the Patreon community. This community is a group of people who believe in what we're doing here at DevTips so much that they donate an amount of their own choosing for each episode to the show. And all of the money that the patrons give is fed back directly into the show, and I'm able to buy nicer equipment to make better videos and also to pay Adam for the videos that he's making for us. Patrons of the show get to see these videos early, and they get extra videos, and they even get a private podcast and monthly video hangouts. And there's also a live 24-hour DevTips chat with a bunch of people in there kind of all the time. Anyhow, join us at patreon.com/devtips, and I'll see y'all next week. Keep on hacking.